Hi and welcome to episode 133 of the Midlife Reshape podcast. Now this week we've got a great interview with Emma Johnson, who is an expert in imposter syndrome. Now I don't feature a lot of expert interviews these days because I'm more looking for those turning point interviews, sharing the stories of people who perhaps have made some big health transformation as a result of a key turning point in life, which I think is really important, really inspirational, and can really be helpful for yourself if you're looking to either get on track or stay on track with a health transformation or a health goal. But this one, and I will be featuring some other expert interviews along as we go along, but I had the privilege of attending Emma's session around imposter syndrome, and I found it really valuable and insightful for a number of reasons. Now, firstly, imposter syndrome is a phrase that seems to be really in vogue at the moment. And with that, for good reason, but with that comes a lot of information, tactics and tips, and perhaps not quite getting to the root of what do we actually mean? What are the types and what does research tell us about how we can perhaps manage that more proactively in ourselves? And that's where the direction that Emma comes from. So it's great to be able in this interview to share this with you because we do dive into the different types of imposter syndrome and how certain tactics and approaches can help us mitigate it. And for me, it's very relevant in the field of, or the area of chasing down our goal, of working towards a health goal, a weight loss goal, or whatever, because I think we can be our own worst enemy. I often say it's not about the diet, and it's not because that doesn't matter, because obviously it does. But where we really undo ourselves is in the self-sabotage, in how we emotionally cope, how we talk to ourselves. And imposter syndrome is a key feature in there for many of us. I certainly related to a lot of what Emma was saying in this session. So I hope that you will get a lot from it. So we'll get on with the interview shortly, but before I do, if I could just encourage you to subscribe if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, to rate and review if you are, or to leave a comment in the YouTube channel or for the video. That's always great at just raising the profile of the podcast. And if you know anybody that you think would benefit from the content, then share an episode, share a particular episode, or share the podcast in general. You could share it via a platform of choice on Spotify, or Apple or YouTube, or via the midlifereshape.com/podcast page. It'd be really great because it really does help spread the word, and for me, help get across to fellow midlifers that, this isn't it. There's more that we can do. It's not over. It's not too late. We can not just transform our health, but our goals, and get life back on our terms for this midlife and beyond. So that would be great. Anyway, for now, on with the interview, and I'll catch you on the other side. Hi then, Emma. It's great to have you along. Been looking forward to this interview. I'm after your expertise on this whole topic of imposter syndrome. But before we get into it, do you want to tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you to this exciting topic?
Hi, Dave. Nice to see you this afternoon. I'm Emma Johnson. I'm a trainer and a coach, and I've worked in and with organisations for a lot of years now. And one of the recurring things I think I've seen over the years in both delivering kind of leadership and management development and coaching kind of at all levels in businesses is this recurring theme sometimes that occurs for people as they start to progress through the organization, particularly where there's kind of self-doubt, questioning of their abilities, questioning of their capabilities and their skills. And what I always find really interesting about that is it's rarely backed up with any evidence. It's very much around how people kind of feel internally, but there is nothing that the external world is seeing about that that kind of inner voice, that critic, that kind of mindset that people potentially carry for themselves, but also the organizations don't really provide structures where people feel that they can be vulnerable about those things either. And so quite often it's a very silent problem that people have. And so I got really interested in the subject, and I actually feel really quite passionately about the subject because I want to break down some of those barriers for people. I want it to be normalized that we all have elements of this going on. Sometimes it's louder than others, but that we can actually overcome some of those reservations, some of those fears, some of those vulnerabilities that we carry with us, sometimes they serve us quite well because they keep us alert, they keep us on our game, but other times actually they become completely counterproductive and they can cause paralysis, which leads to stress, which leads to burnout, which leads to sickness and absence in organizations, none of which organizations obviously want for their people, and the people certainly don't want it for themselves. So it's a subject that I feel is very close to my heart, and it's work that I love doing with people.
Love that. And you kind of press my button straight away when you're talking about what's the research and the science base of it, because obviously I'm not as knowledgeable in your field, but from my sort of side in terms of behavior change and especially around the health and weight loss side, well, there is a lot of rubbish, but there's a lot of confusing information, a lot of claims. And one of the biggest challenges for me and potentially, well, for clients as well, is how do we wade through to actually what do we know? Can we learn some of the things I've bought into or believe, and let's just focus on some foundational principles and some facts that are reasonably pretty well rooted in the scientific research, etc. So I'm all ears for that. So that's cool. So and I love the fact that you're passionate about it, because I think these areas they need that. You're right in terms of raising awareness, and I think it has come on the radar a lot more. This idea of imposter syndrome. Having said that, we need that kind of somebody who cares about it and is willing to do the research underneath. So anyway, enough of my waffling. It's lovely to have you along. What is imposter syndrome then?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and I think over the years that terminology has kind of become more common, vernacular, as it were. It actually dates back to the late 70s when Clance and Immis, two researchers, uh, through their research, identified what they called a phenomenon at the time, and that phenomenon was largely situated around high performing individuals, particularly in academia, but these people who had a whole body of evidence of fantastic work that they'd actually done. But in conversation, these people reported these feelings of being a fraud, about they were just lucky that it was the right place at the right time, that they were worried about being found out in some kind of way, that they weren't quite as gifted and talented as people had thought that they were. Um, and interestingly, it was particularly in high performing individuals that sort of carried this self doubt with them. And as I say, there was this whole kind of body of evidence, this track record with all of these individuals of this amazing work that they'd done. So there was no substance that sat underneath the thinking. So as I say, it's sort of they studied it as a phenomenon and they actually gave it this terminology of imposter syndrome. So that sense of I am a bit of a fraud. It's only a matter of time before people can see underneath the surface that I'm just making it up as I go along, kind of thing, which to some degree we probably all have done at some point in time as we start to learn new things, as we start to assimilate information, and we're all on a journey of learning all the time. Um, so that kind of frames the whole thinking around this imposter syndrome piece. And there have been lots of researchers since then that have started to look at this area. And so a number of years later, a researcher called Valerie Young actually then started to identify different imposter syndrome types. So they're kind of behaviors that were associated with different aspects of imposter syndrome. So she identified 5 different types of imposter syndrome and how it shows up. Now, what I would say about that with those 5 different types is quite often you can have more than one going on at any one time. So there's kind of degrees of perfectionism when things are never quite good enough. There's the kind of the natural genius where you kind of think you should know it all, like we just born fully formed knowing everything. Rather than, it's a process of learning. There's the soloist who kind of feels like they have to carry it all themselves and never asks for help. And quite often when I talk to people about the different types, they kind of go, "Oh, I think I do that one, and I think I do that one," and it's quite normal that you might kind of spread across more than one area in those things. And I think sometimes it's about being able to recognize how and when it shows up for you, because it won't necessarily be in every aspect of your life. There'll probably be certain situations that feel more stressful, where you feel more exposed, where you potentially feel more vulnerable to some degree. But it is a good idea to look at those and understand what the triggers might be. Are there particular things happening in those moments, and strategies, I suppose, for kind of to creating a bit of an antidote to where your brain naturally goes to. I mean, it's that whole thing, isn't it, that we have that negativity bias. We're wired to look for threat. So any of those situations where we feel potentially at threat, uh, uh, we go into overdrive, and we potentially compensate with being very busy, getting very involved, kind of multitasking. So our threat response kind of creates a drive response. And what we find in those moments is very difficult to then have our kind of soothing response that kind of helps us to be able to recalibrate, to be kinder to ourselves, to speak to ourselves like we would to a friend, for example, because nobody's ever going to speak probably more harshly to you than your own internal voice.
Mm. Love that. And I've got lots of notes just already from what you're saying. I've been jotting furiously down here. So if you can hear the scratching of my pencil
Do you need a sharpener?
I probably do actually. The amount of different, it's interesting. Where to start? I think I can relate, and I know that when I speak at conferences around stress and resilience, and then coach around burnout and the health side, how do you reclaim it? Typically, there's a lot of these high performing driven individuals who don't necessarily see themselves as that, as high performing. And I think that's an interesting conversation. And this feeling of a fraud, you mentioned that word. I think that encapsulates a lot of it for a lot of people. I can certainly realize that. I mean, my quick story was when I was promoted quite young in service in the police from PC to sergeant, and I felt another fraud to the extent that I kept my PC's warrant card. You're supposed to hand it in. I kept it for 3 years because I just thought somebody's going to come along and take my straps off us and say, "You're useless. Get back."
That was all an error. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it took me 3 years to start thinking, hang on a minute, looking around and thinking, well, I'm okay, still minimizing. But I think the point of it is that in that time, I did a lot of harm to myself with the stress and the self-sabotage, or as I call it now, self-cabotage. But you highlighted the different types, which I'll come to if you don't mind. But you talked about that sort of talk that we have when we're under stress and how that can lean into or magnify. You didn't say magnify, but I'm guessing I'm interpreting that magnifies this self imposter syndrome, the voice around it. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think that is something I relate to, and I know a lot of people can relate to that, particularly when the pressure's on, as I call it, the voice of self-cabotage gets louder and more critical. So, any
Mm.
thoughts on that?
What, that internal voice and how it kind of
And how that relates
operates?
to imposter syndrome?
Um, yeah, I mean, we all have an inner critic, sadly, and I don't know if you're familiar with the book The Inner Game.
Yeah,
Um, yeah,
yeah,
and it's a little bit like that. The game that you play in life, the hardest game you play in life is actually the game you play against yourself. You know, the outer world sees what they see. So your example of, that promotion, the outer world was seeing somebody very accomplished who was ready to take on that responsibility, and nobody else was questioning that. They were like, "Yeah, Dave's like good for this," and then they saw you doing it. It was your inner game that
yeah.
was the bit that was holding you back. And so to some degree that is our imposter syndrome, that is that inner voice that is niggling away at
Mm,
our self-belief. And I suppose it's that thing where we sort of see all the things that we maybe feel like we don't know well enough, that we haven't maybe had the exposure that other people think that we have. They're not seeing the kind of inner struggle to some degree about the decision making and the sense of overwhelm that we're feeling, and those kind of things. So that sits very much inside us, and we we don't feel comfortable to ever talk about those things. We just feel that, everybody else is going about their business, looking completely on top of things and very accomplished and very together. So we assume it must be us, because if they all look like that, then it must be me. And unfortunately, it becomes a very lonely experience for people. And so it's not until they get ill, it's not until stress becomes unmanageable, it's not until a point that they're at burnout that they actually start to talk about it. and then they can maybe have different reflections on it, see it from a different point of view, realize that a lot of the coping strategies that they've probably been adopting are completely counterintuitive to these elements in some way. So that voice is that voice can be very loud, but also quite unchecked.
Mm.
And I think that's a problem in organizations, but probably also societal.
Yeah.
There isn't enough kind of permission to bring in those areas into conversation about how people are really doing, and how learning is ongoing, and it's okay to not to know things, and it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay not to be perfect.
Mm. I love that. And what I was thinking there was that the it's not all higher performing individuals. I certainly wouldn't have said I was a higher performing individual when I was promoted. I had a lot to learn, but I still went on a journey of internally just grinding myself into the ground. But I think it's this thing that we're not taught any of this. I don't know about now. I would like to think there's a little bit more in now. And I certainly know with my daughter Rosie, they do talk more constructively around emotions, which I think is a
Mm.
really positive thing. But back then we weren't taught about this. We weren't taught about what role do your emotions and your thinking serve, and how can you cope positively. What I did and what many people do is they try to apply the same things that get them the success at work, the driving kind of thing, to the problem internally. Either dismiss it, crush it down, carry on, or be very cruel and critical to themselves. And as you said the counterintuitive thing, and I think that is so, so true. It is counterintuitive to think about, well, actually, that's not a solution. It's making it worse, intensifying it, and actually slowing down. Stop, reflection, kindness. It's
There's so many things in what you've just said there, Dave. So first of all, I challenge whether you were high performing at that point that you got your
well, maybe
first
that's makes
promotion.
it so now.
And I think that's interesting in and of itself about what we're talking about here, because what you told me was you were promoted at an early age. Now, you tend not to promote people at an early age unless they're showing signs of high performance. And showing signs of high performance doesn't mean that you are absolutely at the top of your game with
Yeah.
nothing to improve upon. It means that you are performing well within the confines of the role that you currently have. So I wanted to challenge that first of
Yeah.
all.
Just to come back on that, I get you, because I think this illustrates just how much the habit these can be ingrained, and that you deal with it perhaps at a tactical level,
Yeah.
but the underlying stories and narratives are still rooted there. And that's something I deal with a lot in terms of the work I do around burnout and health transformation. It's these are really rooted. So there's a good point. So thank you for that, because I think I'm kind of chuckling away there.
But
Mm.
sometimes it does take somebody else to hear
Yeah.
you to be able to reflect it back for you to say, well, hold on a minute, actually, that's a different reflection than the one that I'm carrying. And that can be really powerful for some people.
Yeah.
The other point I wanted to pick up on that you made there was emotions. Our emotions play an important role for us. They're not sort of a nice to have. They're there and they serve a purpose. They're telling us information. They're data. And I think quite often we don't have a broad enough language for emotions. So we have feelings that we can't verbalize, that we can't talk about, that we don't have the right words for. And there's a really interesting piece of research, particularly in about giving children language for emotions, and how and the difference it makes to how well adjusted they are, really, that it's we should normalize having emotions. We can have a whole range of different emotions, and to recognize the purpose that they serve. And some emotions will feel negative and some will feel positive. Some will feel like they're high energy, some will feel like they're low energy, and all of these obviously feed into that belief about ourselves that we carry to some degree. Once we can recognize the emotions, we can become better at self-care,
Yeah.
because we can recognize where we're getting into stress and burnout, and then we can recognize what are the soothing parts I need to actually start to implement here. How do I actually recognize my accomplishments? How do I counterbalance the negative voice that's screaming at me really loudly at the moment? I think we also underestimate the power of feedback, and what that can do for helping us to actually reappraise ourselves to some degree. in the way that other people see us, because it's probably rarely, if ever, as harshly as if we're going to see ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think it's interesting when you say that I coach male and female, have probably a greater proportion of female clients, which
Mm.
in itself probably says a bit about some of the challenges that men. But you talked about the language of emotions. I think that clearly, when you look at some of the literature about difference, one of the protective factors for women, and I'm oversimplifying it just to illustrate the points. There's a lot more complexity and a lot more challenges there, but there's generally there's more of a language around emotion
Mm.
than men were. I'm a man in the 70s, and I remember reading something in The Economist years ago that the 1970s child has grown up to be the most suicidal generation. Now that's don't necessarily go into that side of things just now, but I think part of that was because of probably the time and breakdown of communities, a lot of that, but it was also on the back of you just don't talk about this stuff. It isn't data and signal, it isn't information, it's a weakness to
Yes.
and we don't have a language. I still struggle with it now. I'm 53. I go on holiday with a couple of mates and we talk about stuff. And even now, or only now, we start to talk about. We don't really get into emotions. It's just it's so deeply ingrained.
It is, yeah, and you're right. So, they are those stereotypes, gender stereotypes about, kind of women go out and they have conversations and they ask each other questions about families and how they feel, and men go out and they talk about football and they banter, and there isn't that permission in the same way. Although interestingly, the work that Clance and Imes did back in the 70s it was predominantly a female trait, this imposter syndrome. It impacted women much more than men. I think as time goes on, what we can see is there is more of a shifting of the needle in some of those things. It still does tend to be more women than men, and it tends to be younger people rather than older people. And I don't know about you, Dave. I think we're of a similar age, but I found the older I get, sort of the less I care a little bit about what
Yeah.
other people think, and I feel much more um, secure in I suppose my abilities and being able to kind of express myself more honestly and with more transparency than I did when I was younger.
Yeah.
But I think because of the way that we are shifting, as you say, the 70s was a unique time and place. There is more permission, there is more emphasis, there's more conversation generally, particularly about men's mental health. So you're starting to see those numbers in men and imposter syndrome also creep up. So it's there, they're just not as honest about it.
Yeah, and we could go in a whole direction just in that because I
Mm.
love exploring that, but I'm conscious of time. So what
Yeah,
I want to do, I think what you've said in terms of it is how we sort of start to reframe our emotions. That's something I talked about an episode a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about my Shite Guide to dealing with things, emotional coping.
yeah,
We need to see our emotions differently, and that's when we can tap into the appropriate soothing self-care, whatever, however we frame it. Before that, then you mentioned a few of the types of imposter syndrome, and I'm really interested in that. So, I appreciate we haven't got like the time that you might dedicate in one of your sessions and workshops, and I had the pleasure of being on one of your sessions a few weeks ago, which was really this is why we're talking. Could you give us a bit of a headline for each of the five, and then we'll see if there's some, I'll kind of see if I can pick some questions out of that that might be particularly relevant to people who are struggling with burnout and or coping and soothing strategies like binge eating, comfort eating, that kind of thing.
sure. Yeah. So the first one is perfectionism. I think lots of people are familiar with that terminology. They understand what that means. And the difficulty, of course, of perfectionism is nothing is ever perfect, and we should never strive for perfection. It's a hiding to nothing, really. There's a degree of having to learn that good is good enough, and we work in such high pressurized environments now. Deadlines are kind of getting shorter and shorter, workloads are getting higher and higher, that we can't keep tinkering with things until this kind of imagined mythical perfect thing is finally complete. And so quite often it's about learning when to stop, when enough is enough, because you can keep adding, but actually it's about at what point do I know I've added value? And then that's enough. I don't need to kind of throw the whole kitchen sink into it. And it can be quite hard. Quite often, like giving yourself a very specific time frame. I'm going to give myself 2 hours to complete this task. And at the end of that task, it's going to be good enough. Because otherwise you go back the next day and you add something else, and you go back the next day and you add something else. So you have to be quite clear with yourself about that. And it's about building new habits, really, around the way that we work and the way that we see our work. And if necessary, get somebody else to have a look at it and say, yeah, no, that is absolutely great. It does everything that we need. So perfectionism is the one that probably most people have heard of and are familiar with and may well have experienced. I remember quite a few years ago when my daughter, who has quite a lot of perfectionism, first started at secondary school, and I watched her one night redo a piece of homework 6 times, and she kept kind of just tinkering, and it wasn't like it wasn't such a different piece of work at the end of each time she rewrote it. It was a tinkering, and then we had parents' evening, and I raised it with her teacher and said, I'm quite concerned about what I'm seeing about this. And he was like, no, I think it's brilliant that she cares so much, that she's so passionate. And we had quite a frank exchange of views about that. And I was like, there is no way you are going to encourage perfectionism in my daughter. This is not useful for anybody. So no, she won't be doing every piece of homework 5 or 6 times until either of you are satisfied with it. The learning, of course, comes from the experience. That was the key thing. So that's perfectionism. Then you've got the soloist.
Mm.
Sorry, did you want to jump in there about the perfectionism?
No, but I could, but I'll let you give the headlines because I'm a recovering perfectionist. I really
Okay. Then we've got the soloist. The soloist tends to want to do everything on their own. They don't necessarily feel that they can ask for help. That they've got to be this kind of one-man band, if you like, to some degree. That they've got to kind of know it all. Sorry. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Which one was I talking about? The soloist.
Yeah.
Soloist, yeah. So they're the kind of lone wolf, and they that sense of kind of accomplishing everything on your own kind of really drives a lot of their behavior. I don't need anybody else's help. Of course, you can end up feeling like a martyr like that, and I can be quite guilty of this one myself. So I don't need anybody else's help. I can get it all done. No, I'll take that on too. No, I'll take that on too. And then I sit there and say, why is it always me? Why am I doing all these things? I can't get all this done. So, I mean, I think, for me, I have to sometimes remind myself there is absolutely no shame in asking for help, for asking for advice, for recognizing that there are different experiences that other people have that might actually really be beneficial to me. And once I kind of recognize that about other people, I'm much more open to letting those that come into my space, as it were. So every once in a while, when we find ourselves sort of just saying, no, I can do it all, no, I'll do it all on my own, we do have to remember that collaboration is there for a reason. It brings us together, it brings shared learning, it brings diversity of thought, it probably improves the overall outcome.
Yeah.
We then have the Superman, Superwoman, and this is about people who really are trying to do everything. So they tend to probably spend longer at work than other people. They probably feel a bit stressed if they're not utilizing every minute of the day, where that downtime is sort of a bit of wasted time, that they'd rather be occupied doing work things. They may well have left kind of hobbies or passions get sacrificed a little bit, because it's like, keep doing things, keep achieving. Even when you could quite easily leave the office for the day or turn your laptop off and switch off, there's still like, oh, there's that other thing. And so this in particular is the thing that leads to burnout more than anything for me personally, because you're not building in periods of rest. You're not building in physical periods of rest. You're not building in mental periods of rest, but you're also probably not doing any of the kind of physical things that keep you fit and healthy, moving, getting out into the fresh air, all those kind of really important parts of our overall well-being. So we do have to make sure that we are building in those habits. We should make sure that we are not waiting for other people to make us feel good about our work, about how we validate ourselves. That actually that's entirely within ourselves and self-driven to some degree. So we need to be able to kind of look at pieces of work and much more objectively recognize what's been good, what's been what's met the required standards. Then we have the natural genius. So this idea that we should be kind of born knowing everything. That you probably achieved well at school. You probably had a kind of fairly good, if not very good grades at school. You probably got lots of gold stars for everything that you did. You were probably often told as a child that you were kind of, smart and clever, and that was a kind of standing probably within your social group or within your families or within your peers. So setbacks really do knock people who potentially have this potential genius trait. It really kind of knocks their confidence. It makes them question everything they kind of have ever believed or been told about themselves. What can happen, of course, with that is sometimes we avoid taking on things that feel too challenging because the fear of failure in that is overwhelming, because we need to be, maintain that kind of sense of we're bright, we're clever, we do things well. And so we're not recognizing the value of learning. We're not recognizing the value of kind of striving into areas that push our comfort zones to some degree. So we've got to recognize that learning is a lifelong journey, skill building is a lifelong journey, and accomplishing kind of self-improvement is an ongoing process in some kind of way. And then we have finally the expert. The expert is the kind of person that probably shies away from applying for a job if they don't look at the job spec and think that they could do 95% of it. The expert is somebody who probably is adding kind of qualifications, certifications, elements of training to their CV and their track record, because the more I can acquire these things, the more it proves my expertise, the more it proves how knowledgeable I am. So you can often feel like there's I just don't know enough yet. There's always something else to learn. There's always something else to learn. So the difficulty, of course, is how that leads to procrastination to some degree. That yes, there is always more to learn, but not when it prevents us from actually being able to take action and kind of propel ourselves forward in some kind of way. And I often find that rather than just kind of trying to acquire knowledge for knowledge's sake, to take the approach around kind of just-in-time learning here is really useful. So we do learning at the point that we know that we're about to put a skill into practice, rather than just having it there like in our back pocket just in case we need it, but much more because it's something we're about to practice in some kind of way. And I think what's important about that is it helps to embed that learning, because we're then applying it. When it just kind of sits as a conceptual thought in the back of our heads, of course, it doesn't really resonate, and when we come to apply it, it's a little bit confused and out of kilter.
Yeah, love
So
that.
that's the five.
I've got so many notes here.
Sorry, I feel like I've just downloaded at you.
What I probably can see is potentially if I just ask for questions following the podcast, and either do a sort of if you will, a bit of a follow up to some of the questions. I'm at risk of turning this into my own personal therapy session here. I can kind of almost tick, I think, 4 out of 5, and probably a tad on the what was it, the third one you mentioned. Oh, I've written it down. Oh, the Superman. Yeah.
Yeah.
Without necessarily going into that, I think there's a lot that people can relate to. The genius one is an interesting one, because I think you can have periods where you have. I remember when I was pre-promotion, actually, one of my sergeants, most influential, still a close friend now, really saw something in me and really sort of pushed me, which led me to go for promotion, etc. But then I was promoted and I really struggled, and I didn't quite have the connection there with him at that time. The coach type of thing throughout. He's a classic coach, to be fair. And that was when this idea of I can suddenly became doubt because of the experience. And really, when you look at it, it was learning. It was
Yeah.
challenge, learning, and growth. But I didn't have the framework for that. So I think this can be something that perhaps you can grow through childhood. But if you have periods of success, maybe you can, and then something. If you're
Mm.
not quite ready to reframe it, or you don't have the tools to say, this is what happens, you
Yeah.
try something different. I think,
Well, of course, and as I'm listening to you say that, then we start to get into that whole area of kind of the Carol Dweck work
mm,
with growth mindsets,
mm,
and growth mindsets are on a continuum.
yes,
We're not all one or all of the other, so we carry these beliefs with us from probably quite early on in life about our abilities to some degree, and so that whole growth mindset about believing that that we're not a finished article. We can always learn new things, that we are in progress is really helpful when we get kind of confronted by those imposterish type thoughts. I mean, for example, I'm really not very good at maths. Now, I've had a fixed mindset about maths pretty much my whole life and saying, oh, I'm rubbish at maths, I can't do maths. To the point where I've tried in vain to actually pass a maths exam at a standard that like most of the population would recognize as a required standard. Now, I also have an MA, so it's not an academic ability because otherwise my belief would be I I can't do academia. So if I could change my mindset, it's probably not beyond me to pass a maths exam. It just doesn't affect my life enough these days to do anything about that. I could switch that thinking and say it's going to challenge me, but it's not beyond my abilities to do this if it mattered enough to me. Now, I'm not saying that imposter syndrome is because people don't think something matters enough to them. It can sometimes matter too much,
yes.
and then we can get into paralysis.
Yeah, love that. And actually, there's that's an interesting one because there is. You talked about just in case versus just in time, learning and development, and I think that's a good way to look at it. It's not trying to fix ourselves all at once in every way. I might tick a few of those, but it's actually where am I at now? What is serving me now, and what is not? And let's chunk it down, as I would say, chunk the cabbage, the challenge into sprout-sized actions. And you're talking about there, well, if it was important enough and it mattered enough, or you have enough spare time and you think, yeah, I really want to nail it, then fine. But there's other challenges in life. We don't have to be the perfectionist, the finished article. So in that spirit, you talked about habit change, etc. If somebody's listening to this and they're kind of, I relate to that, and not necessarily, I'm not going to pick one out of random, but as a general approach, if somebody said, yeah, I'm probably 2 and 3, and I'm 1 and 5, 1 and 4, whatever, how would you encourage them to start this journey of developing themselves? Developing. You said something at the beginning about developing something to counter or the antidote to the self-sabotage that can arise. How would they start developing their own antidote?
Well, I suppose it has to start with self-awareness. All of this stuff starts with self-awareness. So in what situations, because it probably won't be every aspect of your life where it's showing up. So
Mm,
what are the situations that it starts to show up in, and
mm,
how does it manifest itself? And then once we've got that self-awareness, we can become more aware of when it crops up. So then we can actually start to work with what's happening in those moments. And really, what the situations that it's cropping up in are the event, as it were. We then having an emotional reaction, but what sits underneath that emotional reaction is a belief. So we need to kind of reframe some of that thinking. So the first antidote, I think, is about cognitive reframing. So reframing the thinking. So that inner voice, as we've kind of said, is very harsh, very critical, very negative, and paints the worst case scenario and kind of plays into that idea of that kind of fixed mindset to some degree. I'm rubbish at this. I can't do things. Everybody's going to think I'm an idiot.
mm.
It's all that kind of thing, but that's probably not very realistic. So the cognitive reframing is then starting to think about what's a more realistic version of this. So if it's I can't do maths, it might be I haven't yet found a teacher to work with that could support me with this. I haven't yet given it the time that would allow me to. I haven't learnt the right formulas yet. And that kind of the power of the word yet is transformational, quite honestly,
Yeah.
because it gives us space, it gives us reflection, it gives us breathing, and it gives us permission to be that work in progress, to be on a journey, if you like. So that's one of the things is, first of all, get really aware of what are the triggers, what are the situations, what's going on around that, and then examine those beliefs a little bit. Then start to kind of work with, well, I recognize I think these things a lot in those moments. And what's a more realistic version? What would I say to a friend who came and had this conversation with me? How would I actually coach them? How would I advise them? What would I be saying to them? And that's the voice you want to learn to hear in your head, to some degree. I think one of the other things that's a really lovely exercise, is an ongoing exercise, to some degree, is kind of like a life map, so that we can actually start to chart our successes. So from very early on in life, we will have had some successes, whether it was passing year 11 plus, whether it was winning an award at school for a piece of poetry, or your first, your GCSEs, your A levels, if you went to university, if you got an apprenticeship. These are all your first promotion. The things that you're most proud of, they don't even have to be work based. They can just be things that you've done because it's a sheer love of something, a hobby, whatever it may be. But what you're looking at is this pattern, if you like, that kind of emerges through our lives. So in all those moments where we're being really harsh on ourselves and going, "Oh, I'm such an idiot because I said the wrong thing in that presentation," we can look back and think, "Well, is it the only time I've ever said something that, like, I thought in the cold light of day, I might have said it differently? Has that stopped me? Has that held me back?" So you're building this track record of evidence. So those moments where you're most vulnerable, where you're most questioning yourself, you can see that there is this whole history that supports achievement. And then rather than thinking about outcomes about situations, in terms of the presentation has to go flawlessly, I can't get a single word wrong, I have to remember to say these 5 points on this slide, otherwise it's all a complete disaster. Rather than think about it in those absolute outcome terms, think about it as experience. So all of that experience is building to my track record. So there was a point that I didn't manage to include on that slide, but that's okay, because I'm going to follow up in an email. I'm just going to make sure I make the point there. It's not the be all and end all. Nobody else has gone home and is thinking about the thing that you didn't say in that moment. And even if you did say something that you maybe thought, I wish I hadn't said that, they're also not going home and thinking about that thing either. They're much more focused on the things they said and did than they'll ever be on what you said and did. So I think it's about being able to step back a little bit, to look at yourself from the outside, and reappraise some of those situations. And it can be quite useful sometimes to start to think about the kind of physiological stuff that's happening in those moments. In those moments, we might be aware that we've got really sweaty palms. We might be aware of the butterflies going on in our stomach, and we're interpreting all of those things as sign of our nerves, signs that we're not good enough. But actually, some of those sensations could be excitement. Some of those sensations could be the adrenaline of doing something new and challenging ourselves a bit. So they can be positives. They don't have to be seen as negatives in some way.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, you you talk about that past, looking for past evidence, and I think that's an important bit because we spend such a lot of time in our heads with that negative voice. Not everybody, but obviously a fair few, particularly if we're carrying around these things. So to have the evidence otherwise is really important. Yeah.
And what's really important about that, because really what we're trying to do is rewire the brain slightly away from that negativity bias. Because when we think about track record, quite often what we go to are all the things that we wish we'd done differently or better. That's not what we're seeking out here. We're actually looking for the evidence that supports a different analysis of those situations, that we do have this, and we take it for granted when we just do kind of good stuff. Well, I should just be doing that stuff. And so we don't recognize those moments. And, I do a lot of work in corporate organizations. And what I see there is that actually this is where the role between kind of managers and leaders and their people becomes so important, because you can really help people in those moments by helping them to recognize for themselves that they need more they need more positive praise, that we can overcome that negativity bias if we find the moments to call that stuff out, catch people doing something right, and let them know about it.
Love that. And I think what you remind me of is that this is a learning journey. It's a process. I mean, I delivered a new early try tested topic on Friday, and I saw myself afterwards go into my usual hyper reflection, which is in the past has always been negative. And I've learned that I can't just stamp down on that process. What I've got to do is look for, well, what's the benefit in reflecting on? So that sort of almost like, I think of it like martial arts, like Aikido. You can either, Aikido is you work with the force of the other person and then you move them that way rather than just out and out resist. And for me, a lot of this is about there's something in the natural reflective process that's trying to help you.
Mm.
Might be misguided and over exaggerated, overcooked, but so trying to just speed up that process back to getting to a place where, right, I'm comfortable. I've learned what I need to do. I'll make these changes. I'm happy with it in general. That kind of thing. That's a journey to get to, isn't it? It's learning as we go.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And if your tendency is to kind of do that bit where you dissect and
Mm.
overanalyze kind of recent performance, then make a deal with yourself that you're going to allow yourself to just do that for 5 minutes, and then you're actually going to start to like switch that thinking around,
Love it.
where you start to also then recognize the other side of that, all the
Yeah.
things that actually went well, the things that you have learnt as a result of it. So, uh, um, you know, uh, the element that maybe you're being negative about, well, actually, my learning from that is, I'm going to do this differently next time in this kind of way. It's perfectly fine to be learning.
Yeah.
We learn all the time, and it, it's a well-trodden kind of trope that some of the greatest learning comes from our mistakes and our failures. That's true, but we have to not beat ourselves up for the a perceived, and it is a perception. I mean, most of us aren't making such catastrophic mistakes that anything's really in jeopardy, anything really important is in jeopardy. It's just part of our ongoing learning.
Yeah. I love that. I love that idea of putting a time limit on. And it's like almost like, well, I can say, right, here's the deal. You can think about this, what we are going to look at, so it's kind of how you find ways to do that. I love the idea of putting a time limit on. I never really thought about it like that. You would give yourself that, but you have a deal with yourself that you're going to shift it round going
Yeah,
forward.
it's something that somebody shared with me quite a few years ago now, but it was that kind of like, if it isn't going to matter in 5 years' time, then don't give it more than 5 minutes thinking.
Love it. Yeah.
And how many things are really going to matter in 5 years' time? Very few. And most of the things that we're catastrophizing about in those moments never even happen. They just don't come true. And yet it takes up so much energy. Um, I think another thing that's quite interesting about some of this area in terms of kind of challenging a little bit is become aware of the thought, how often that thought recurs, and any kind of statement that might go with it, as it were. And then what's it helping you to feel or do? And then what's it stopping you from feeling or doing? And when we start to actually see how we're getting in our own way with stuff, as it were, the things that it might prevent us from uh, doing that we enjoy, that challenging us, that takes on new areas, any of those kind of things, then you can kind of sit back and really kind of say, is this serving me well? And what cost
Mm.
is this having for me? And that in itself can be quite important. And I think it's a good idea to write these things down. It's all very
Mm.
well to have the thought, but when you can look at it on a page and say, well, look, that thought came up 5 times this week. What's that doing for me? How am I feeling in those moments? Is it helping me? And in what ways is that holding me back?
Yeah, love that. And I'm a big fan of getting it out of your head in a conversation, but particularly on paper if you can, so you can actually see it. That's really powerful. I love that as an approach as well. What is it helping me with, and what is it effectively getting in the way of or stopping me? So I love that. I'm conscious of time. We could go on forever, but if I could sort of maybe ask for a future appearance, I don't want to be cheeky in that.
Yeah,
I know your
yeah,
time.
I'd love to.
But if and when I collect some questions up, because I'm conscious that I think this is something that will be very much top of mind, and the link between the coping behaviors that often undermine our health, which is where I like to work, and the things that can often lead us to doing those unhelpful coping strategies can be rooted in things like perfectionism and the other areas of self imposter syndrome. So I think you've given some great tactics as well to help us look at that more generally and then apply them if we identify them. But I'm sure there'll be some specific questions on that. So just as a wrap up, you obviously said that you work a lot in this. What kind of, just kind of a shout out for you, what kind of work do you do? As a coaching, workshop, speaking, that kind of thing? Just in case there's a listener who might be thinking, I need something like that in my organization, if there's anything like that. And we will share links and stuff in the show notes. But if there's a link or an email that you want to promote in the audio of the podcast, then go for it now,
That's lovely. Thank you. So I do a lot of work with corporates, as I say. I'm primarily a kind of leadership and management development specialist. But through my coaching, there are all sorts of other areas that I realise have an impact. So I also do workshops around resilience, stress management, overcoming kind of burnout, and obviously this area of imposter syndrome, because they are alive and well in organizations. So I do a lot of work, and I think it's important for leaders and managers to recognize all those things. It improves them as leaders and managers when they have more awareness about managing it for themselves, but also spotting it and working with people in their teams around it. I'm also a mental health first aid instructor, so I accredit mental health first aiders in organizations. And again, that work has come about as a result of the passion I have for making work as the best it can be for people, and helping them to actually feel empowered and enabled in their lives. And we're not just professionals, and we're not just kind of individuals going about our business. We are these whole beings, and so although different things can be happening in different environments and different situations, we have to consider people as people and make sure that they have the relevant support around them. So all the work I do is really about trying to make sure that that's fully recognised for themselves as individuals, but also within organisations.
Brilliant, lovely. And as I say, we'll put links and connection in show notes if anybody does want to get in touch, or you can drop me a line at the usual dave@restlessmidlifer.com, and I'll obviously forward anything on. But I have a feeling you'll be coming back.
I'd love to.
If not just for me.
Yeah.
Because actually, it's really helpful to tease out the dimensions of imposter syndrome. So that's been really, really useful. So thank you very much. And I'm sure the listeners and viewers will get such a lot from it. So thank you very much for your time. And listeners, if you have any questions or thoughts or feedback, then please do feed them in, and I'll channel some of those to Emma in due course, and we'll no doubt have you back. But thank you for your time. It's been brilliant.
Thank you, Dave. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I'll look forward to the next one.
Thanks for listening. You can check out the show notes and other episodes at midlifereshape.com/podcast. And it'd be great if you could subscribe, share, rate, review, and all of that. That would be magic. And if you are a midlifer and you're finding that your health has taken a back seat, and you really want to get life back on your terms, put stress in its place, and start to lose that weight and lose it sustainably long term for midlife and beyond, pop over to midlifereshape.com to find out about the community membership. And I'd love to see you there. Any feedback or questions or ideas for future show topics or guests, then drop me a line at dave@restlessmidlifer.com. And just one more shout out to Logan Nicholson of musicformakers.com for the awesome music for the podcast. And that's it for now. Take care, keep sweating the right sprouts, and look after yourself.